In this video, we'll start to look at some basic key concepts about scientific methods. Now, in many ways, the development of scientific method really was, in many ways, you can think of it as a killer app that was developed. This was a way of looking at the world in order to make observations or to form questions and hopefully answer those questions to give you insight about the world. And it seems so simple now, but it really was revolutionary in terms of the way humans saw themselves personally, and also within their environment and their universe. Now, we're going to see that there's two major types. There's the inductive and the it's a mouthful, hypothetical deductive method. Okay, and these are the two ways today that we largely try and understand the world. Now, important to that is the concept of experimental design. Hopefully objective and reliable results. And we'll talk a bit about what a hypothesis is, a little bit of a fact, a law, and a theory when it comes from the science perspective. Now, once again, this could be its own standalone course, and we're not going to go there. But I'd like to introduce at least two names. There's Francis Bacon, who was from England, and René Descartes from France. And they were both philosophers. Now, back then, philosopher had a different meaning than today. Philosophers today, we tend to think, pondering the meaning of the universe or ethics, etc. Back then, a philosopher was one who sort of explored and thought about the world. So they could dabble in either what we now call science or arts or true philosophy that we sort of understand today. But what happens is that it's not just Bacon and Descartes, but they were two of the main forces, is that they helped to invent a new way of asking questions. So they invented new habits, if you want to think of that, of scientific thought for a creative, objective process. They came up with ways to sort of look at what's the same, what's different, what are trends. Can we draw from these trends to make generalizations and predictions from observable facts? Now, I won't go into the history, but if you notice, Bacon was from England, Descartes was from France, and there's historic sort of background as to why was it them. And one of the reasons is that the governments of both England and France had actually established academies of science, which still exist today. So the kings and the royalty in both those countries had basically sat down and said, hey, I think there's something to be gained by putting money into basically an institute that would start thinking about where the world is and how the world runs, because knowledge is power to some degree. And that's how we ended up with what we now know as science. Now, there's two methods. There's the inductive method, and largely Francis Bacon's name gets attached to this. And what this one is, it's about making a whole number of observations until one predicts with confidence what's going to happen. So it gives you ability for predictions. I'll give you a case from my academic studies. Is that when I was a graduate student, I was asked my graduate supervisor, I'm just going to draw a knee joint here, to spend some time and look at, this is the knee joint, okay, believe it or not, that's the knee joint, to look at how blood circulates around the knee joint. And look at the pattern, because near the back of the knee an artery comes, it passes through, but it sends branches that work its way around. And he actually asked me to go off and basically dissect, I think it was a couple hundred knees that we had in our anatomical collection, and look at how the blood vessels are distributed. Why? Why is this important? Because, of course, blood distribution to a tissue has a big impact on how quickly it heals. And also, there's human variation. So it would be good to know what's the most common pattern. And this is a method the inductive method, is one that's really used quite often in the world of anatomy. So the knowledge of anatomy is often obtained this way. And let's say if I dissect 3 knees, it would be hard to predict what the pattern would be in the 4th knee, especially if all 3 knees were slightly different. But after you've dissected a few hundred knees, you get a pretty good sense that 70% of the knees fall into this pattern, maybe 15% into that, 5 into this, 4 into that. So by collecting enough data points and enough observations, it allows you to make the fairly accurate predictions that the next time you see this, what it would be. So when we talk about proof in science, this is a hot point in science. It results from hopefully reliable observations that are repeatedly confirmed, and they're not falsified by any credible observation. So this is about looking at some over and over and over and over and over and over until you're pretty sure what it is. Now I want to point out, and this drives people sometimes crazy who are not in science, that in science all truth is tentative. You always notice that scientists will put just a little bit in doubt, right? Just a little bit of wiggle room into their comments. It's not that they're trying to be wishy-washy, but as scientists, we got to realize that what we understand now may change. Just think of the pandemic we're experiencing here in the fall of 2020, is that our knowledge of the virus and how it interacts with people has changed tremendously in just 6 months. So truth is always being updated, and we may not ever absolutely reach what we consider to be truth, but we get closer to it. Now, hopefully proof gets to the point where it's beyond reasonable doubt. The second method is basically the hypothesis deductive method, where you use hypothesis and deductive reasoning. And this is how most physiological knowledge is gained. And this is what most people think is science. You develop a hypothesis. Now, what's an hypothesis? It's not just any wild guess. It's an educated guess or speculation. Speculation is probably a better word, because guess makes it sound like you're just making it up. And good hypotheses are often, but not always, consistent with what is already known, and they also have to be testable. That if I ask a question, I have to have a way to answer that question, and that's key. So I formulate a question, I formulate a way of trying to answer that question, and that is the basis of it. Now, often we hear about something called falsifiability. If we claim something is scientifically true, you must be able to specify what evidence it would take to prove it wrong. And that's probably a discussion we'll get into a bit more when we start talking about writing a lab report further into this course. Now, experimental design. There's a number of things you should be aware of. When you put together an experiment, it has to have a certain amount of rigor. It has to be as tight as it could be. And of course, some of the key things to consider are sample size. If I only looked at, let's take the example of developing a vaccine for COVID. If I only inject the vaccine into 3 people and then try and figure out, oh, how's it, go, wow, I tried it in 3 people. How does this apply to the billions of people in the world, right? A small sample size tends to be very unreliable, which is why in the case of COVID, in phase 3 studies, and phase 3 is the last study that they do before they potentially approve a therapy or a vaccine, they're looking at injecting 30,000 people, because that gives you better comfort. If 30,000 people receive this injection and there was diversity in this 30,000 group, it's probably a safe vaccine. So sample size. You're always looking at how big was the sample size when you're trying to evaluate how good a scientific paper is. So a larger sample size is much better. Controls. Was there a control group that did not receive the treatment? All right. You also have to try and build in a way to tease out any of the placebo type of effects that may occur, the psychosomatic effects. Because often, just because people think that they received a medication or a treatment, they will report feeling better, even though that treatment may have not had any effect. Also, experimental bias is, if I was the person who invested all the time to set up the experiment, and I knew who got the drug and who did not get the drug, and I was the one recording all the observations and all their comments, whether or not I'm being truthful with myself, I may actually introduce some bias because, even subconsciously, I have a vested interest that this is going to work. And that's why we use double-blind studies. And of course, the real way that we tease out these numbers, it's very rare that if you have a drug and you give 100 people the new drug, and 100 people get remarkably better, and those who did not get the drug, none of them get better. It's very rare that you have it that clear cut. Usually the numbers are a bit messier. So thank goodness, we have the science of statistical testing, which is a way of mathematically teasing out how correct the data is, and it's an art form to itself. And that's why when you look at scientific papers, one of the first things to look at is the statistical testing. And of course, peer review is essential in science. You take your ideas, you put them out there to your colleagues in the public, and they critically evaluate your work. And often this is done if you're looking for funding. They'll peer review your proposals or your publication. So we often hear about the question, was that article peer reviewed? If it's peer reviewed, it gives you a good comfort level that those with a great knowledge in the subject have looked at it and they think it's worthy, that there's no inherent problems to put this paper forward to read. And hopefully what this does, it ensures honesty, objectivity, and hopefully quality in science. And most of the time it works very well. Now, last few things we're going to talk about are some terms. Scientific facts, information that can be independently verified. It's one definition, right? We'll run with it. Law of nature, generalizations about the way matter and energy behave. This comes from repeated observations. Often inductive reasoning is behind it. And often it's written out as a verbal statement or mathematical formula. When I say theory, right, people often mistake theory as sort of a wild guess. No, once you hit the point of theory, there's a fair amount of supporting evidence for this. It's pretty solid. It's an explanation or a series of statements derived from facts, laws, and confirmed hypotheses. So this is sort of the top tier. And often it summarizes what we know, but it also leaves open some room for suggestions as to where the further study would go. Okay, that's a really quick walkthrough behind sort of the basics of scientific theory, some of the people behind it, two of the major methods. As I said before, this could easily be its own full course, but at least we've had a little sampling. We're going to leave it there, and we'll pick up human origins and adaptations in the next video.